Today we will be having two sessions. One is from anatomy. Dr. Nithin, tutor anatomy, will be presenting the first session. The first session is about trigeminal nerve part 1. As we all know, it is the largest branch of trigeminal nerve and it is concerned with the sensations from the gentle touch to the cordial reflex, which helps us to protect. So touch to awareness, V1 is very important. Let us hear from Nithin about V1. Welcome, Dr. Nithin.
Good morning, all of you. Myself Nithin from the Department of Anatomy, Pushpagiri Medical College. So today in this section, we will be discussing about the topic related to neuroanatomy and the sensory evaluation of topic and the qualifications of trigeminal. So before going into the detailed anatomy about the ophthalmic divisions of trigeminal, first of all we must know the general concept related to the trigeminal briefly. So trigeminal is a mixed nerve and also the largest of the all the cranial nerves. So here you can see this anteroinferior aspect of the brainstem. So it consists of three main parts. It is the membrane, and this one is the pons, and this one is the medulla. And in the pons, we can see this nerve is arises between the ventral surface of pons and between the middle cerebellar angles by the large sensory lobe and the small motor lobe. Okay, so coming to the functional component of this trigeminal nerve, the sensory lobe conveys the general exoceptive sensation and the propulsive fibers, and the general exoceptive sensation from the skin of the scalp and the face and oral cavity, also the nasal cavity, and the cornea and the conjunctiva, and the most of the cranial filament. Okay, and these bodies of these general sensations are carried out by the trigeminal ganglion. And next one is the propulsive fibers. The fibers from the propulsive sensations are from here we can see the muscles of mastication and also from the extraocular muscles and the muscles of facial expressions. And the ceremonies are located in the mesencephalic nucleus of the cranium. These are discussed from the coming slides. Okay. And the motor lobe conveys the brachiomotor fibers to muscle which develop on the positive brachial arches. And this includes the muscles of mastication and tensiocephality. Also, this is a figure shows that the anterior middle structures of the neck. And here we can see the anterior middle of the digastric and myofibrosis. So these are the muscles which develop on the positive brachial arches. So coming to the nuclear functions of the trigeminal nerve, here we can see, generally we can say that the trigeminal nerve consists of 4 types of nucleus. 3 of them are sensory and the remaining one is motor nucleus. And here in this figure we can see this is a sagittal section of the brainstem. And in this section we can see the lots of nucleus are present. And the nucleus is appears in blue in color and purely sensory. And ones which are appears in red in color, that is motor nucleus. Okay, so this sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is an elongated nucleus, so it is visible from the linear brainstem. So the upper portion of this nucleus, which is extended to the midbrain, which is called as a mesencephalic nucleus, which is situated on the either side of the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, and second one is the principal sensory nucleus, which is situated on the pons. In simple way, we can say that it is situated on the lateral side of the motor nucleus. And this nucleus also continues to the spinal cord, and we can say that it is extended from the corner end of the principal nucleus and up to the second and third cervical spinal segments. And last one is the motor nucleus, which is also situated on the pons, but we can see that here the nucleus is situated on the medial to the sensory nucleus. So these are the nuclear functions of the trigeminal nerves. So coming to the intracranial course of the trigeminal nerve, I already said that the trigeminal nerve arises from the brainstem as a sensory and also motor. So here we can see the grammaton which is present in the posterior cranial fossa, we call as temporal cerebellum. This temporal cerebellum also separated from the cerebellum from the cerebellum. Okay. Now the nerve is inside the middle cranial fossa and it is covered by the fold of the grammaton, that is temporal cerebellum, and overlaps and forms a tail-like appearance which is called as trigeminal vein, otherwise called as mental scale. Okay, this will be clearly seen this here. This is the front end of the trigeminal vein, otherwise called the fold of the grammaton. Okay, and once this passes through this middle cranial fossa, this nerve is just passes lateral to the coronal sinus. Here is the pituitary fossa or hypophyseal fossa. Either side of the pituitary fossa we can see the coronal sinus. Okay, as we can say that the nerve rises is lateral to the coronal sinus. This nerve another figure shows the intracranial fossa of the trigeminal nerve. So now the nerve is inside the middle cranial fossa. The sensory group of trigeminal nerve forms a cluster of group of sensory neurons, forms an enlargement in this middle cranial fossa. That's enlargement is called trigeminal ganglion, otherwise called as basilic ganglion. After forming this ganglion, the nerve is divided into three main branches. And first one is the ophthalmic nerve, maxillary and mandibular nerve. So that we can denote as V1, V2 and V3. And the ophthalmic nerve which is passes through the superior orbital foramen and enters into the orbital cavity. And V2, that is the maxillary nerve which is passes through the opening foramen rotundum and enters into the vertebropalatal fossa, runs forward to the infraorbital groove and enters into the infraorbital foramen sacral phase. Okay, and the third one is the mandibular nerve, which is passes through the foramen orbit along with the motor root of the trigeminal nerve. Once it enters, it is united to form a single tract and separates the infratemporal fossa. Okay, this is all about the intracranial fossa of the trigeminal nerve. So during the time of video, so in this session we just only focusing on the ophthalmic divisions of the trigeminal nerve. So coming to the ophthalmic divisions of the trigeminal nerve, that is the ophthalmic nerve. Okay, this is the smallest branches of the trigeminal nerve and it arises from the anteromedial aspect of the trigeminal ganglion and it pierces the dural fold, that means the cerebellum and it enters into the orbital cavity while passing through lateral to the coronal sinus. And immediately the nerve is divided into three main branches. First one is the lacrimal nerve, and second one is the frontal, and third one is the nasociliary. These all the functional components of these all nerves are the purely sensitive, that is general somatic affair fibers. Okay, and next one is the lacrimal nerve. So this is a figure which shows that the cranial cavity, and here we can see once we remove the orbital tail, that means the roof of the orbit, so we can identify the muscles and nerves and line out very clearly in this figure. Okay, so once this nerve passes from the middle cranial fossa and enters into the anterior cranial fossa, passes through lateral aspect of the tendinous ring. What is tendinous ring? Tendinous ring is nothing but it is a regular structure which is present on the orbital cavity or the extramuscular muscles which is attached to this tendinous ring. Okay, so here we can clearly see that this nerve is just passing through lateral to outside the tendinous ring and enters into the orbital cavity. Okay, this it makes and like a lateral course. So similarly we can see here we can this is a lateral nerve which is passes laterally along the upper border of the lateral rectus muscle and runs forward and it ends by supplying the lacrimal gland. Also it appears as the orbital circle and supplies the lateral part of the upper body. So while passing through this nerve inside the orbit, it is a communicating branch or communicating from the cytomatic nerve to convey the posterior inside this orbital cavity, the nerve is lies in between the roof of the orbit and the lateral vertebrae superiors. The roof of the orbit already we have been removed, so we can see only the lateral vertebrae superiors over here. And this is the anterior part of the orbit. The nerve is divided into two main branches. That is, once it passes the medial aspect of the orbit, that is the supraorbital nerve, and the lateral part which is called the supraorbital nerve. And this supraorbital nerve supplies the skin of the lower part of the forehead, upper eyelid, and the conjunctiva, and the supraorbital nerve supplies the frontal air sinus and upper eyelid, forehead, and scapular vertex. And this is all about the frontal. Okay. So next one is the nasociliary nerve. This nasociliary nerve is also a branch of the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. But previously we discussed two nerves which passes through the tendinous nerve. But in case of nasociliary, it passes directly through the tendinous nerve. Here we can see this as tendinous nerve. Once this nerve arises from the ophthalmic division, it passes through the superior orbital foramen and enters through the common tendinous nerve. And here we can see there is a two muscle nerve being cut. That is the lateral vertebrae superiors and the superior vertebral muscle. So we can see between these two muscles, we can see the nerve passes forward, and between the superior and inferior division of the oculomotor nerve, and enters into the opening called anterior foramen and continues as the anterior nerve. So another important thing we can see in the orbital cavity. Here we can see there is a rounded structure which is present over here. This is nothing but it is a ciliary ganglion. This is an important factor for supplying this nasociliary ganglion for ganglionic actions. Okay, so let's be discussing about what is a ciliary ganglion. So ciliary ganglion is nothing but it's a peripheral parasympathetic ganglion and associated with the nasociliary nerve. And here we can see it consists of generally three rows. So this is a diagrammatic representation of the ciliary ganglion. Here we can see this is ciliary ganglion. From here, the nerve to inferior orbital muscle, from the radicular spinal place, ganglion fibers passes forward and enters into the ciliary ganglion. And from here, it forms a relay on this ganglion. After that, the postganglion fibers from this ganglion enters into the short ciliary nerve and supply the constrictor muscle for constricting the glute. And another set of muscle nerve which is called a sensory loop. It is also arises from the nasociliary nerve and directly passes through the ciliary ganglion, also enters to the short ciliary nerve, and it is also supplying the eyeball. And it does not form any relay in this ganglion. Similarly, we can see that the superior subclavicular sympathetic ganglion and passes from the sympathetic plexus around the internal carotid artery. Also passes through the ciliary ganglion and passes the short ciliary nerve and enters through the orbit. And this two nerves doesn't form any relay in this ganglion. Only the motor root forms a relay section on this ganglion. Okay. Coming to the clinical anatomy about this nerve. First of all, the trigeminal neuralgia. So the patient is suffers from the paroxysmal electric shock pain of photophobia, lacrimation, excessive bleeding bilaterally during this attack. This is a condition which is affecting entire trigeminal nerve. And second one is the purpose of the ophthalmicus. And it indicates the reactivations of the varicella zoster virus which affect the ophthalmic divisions of the trigeminal nerve, which leads to Hutchinson signs and makes an nasal with rashes, spreads involvement by the nasociliary. And third one is the supraorbital neuralgia, similar to the neuralgia of the trigeminal nerve, and it is persistent pain of the frontal and scapula on the supraorbital periphery of the tendinous and the supraorbital nerves. And the fourth one is the cavernous sinus lesion. That means while passing from the posterior cranial fossa or the middle cranial fossa, I already said that the nerve is passes just back to the cavernous sinus. So if there are any issues occurs on the cavernous sinus, it will affect the ophthalmic divisions of the trigeminal nerve. So I have 6 of it, where 3, 4, and 6. So these are my reference.